In fact, our false positive rate dropped to 18%. So we were able to reduce our false positives by almost 80% just by focusing on exactly what it was that we were looking for. So the first 90 days that we turned on the rule, we found 750 potential cases, and we escalated 612 of those.
Welcome to The Edge for Tomorrow. I'm your host, Rose Reed, and today my guest is Deborah Geister, who has spent her career finding what banks miss. As a BSA officer at a bank under consent order, she built detection patterns for human trafficking that dropped false positives from 94 to 18%. Now she's co-founded Section 2, a company that studies how criminals move money, documents their tradecraft, and translates it into, let's say, a wanted poster logic that plugs into banks' existing systems. Her goal is to stop the crimes before they happen. Deborah, welcome. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me, Rose. It's a pleasure.
I would love for you to start us off with the big number, the 1% or the 99%. I would love for you to really situate us in the impact of financial crime, or really the black hole of financial crime.
It's a challenging problem, Rose, because when you look at the industry as a whole, if you look at financial services, we spend about $65 billion a year, those are 2026 numbers, trying to comply with financial crimes compliance. Of that, 60% of that number is manual review. And the reality is, with all that money spent, with all that work that we do to be able to find financial crime, we detect it at less than 1%, right? And those aren't my numbers, those are from the UN. And that's a global number. Less than 1% of all financial or illicit finance that passes through our financial systems is ever detected. So you think about it, that's a 99% failure rate. Those are terrible odds for spending a lot of money. It's a huge problem. It's one that I lived personally when I was, working at the bank and working through a consent order, and it was a real challenge. Luckily, we've discovered there are better ways to be able to help mitigate that risk.
And what is the impact for the layman on that 99% being missed? How does that impact the everyday person or our society or our economy?
There's a whole illicit finance, dark economy, if you will, and there are a number of books out there that are published about this, but there is a whole multi-trillion-dollar industry out there that is illicit finance. Now, when you think about illicit finance, what does that mean?
Wait, did you say multi-trillion?
Multi-trillions, yes. It's a huge economy. I mean, if you look at even just like human trafficking, it generates over $30 billion a year in revenue. Right? And that's just one form of revenue generation in an illicit economy. So when you look at an illicit economy, everything that happens, the reason it's illicit is because the money originates from illegal activity. So if you think about it, drug trafficking, right? Illegal proceeds, human trafficking, slave labor, counterfeiting, wildlife trafficking, all of those things are revenue generation for what we call hybrid threat networks. And those things are all activities that threaten and victimize humans, right? So you think about human trafficking, sex trades. Most people are not in that world because they want to be. They're there because they've been made a victim. The reality is that everything that we can do to help stop those illicit economies is something that we can do to help stop the victimization of human beings.
And how did you personally get into white-collar crime? How did you find this is your calling?
I've always been intrigued and very much followed patterns. As I was working at the bank, one of the things that we discovered is that we had a lot of human trafficking that was coming through the organization. And we discovered this through a couple of ways. We worked very closely with our law enforcement partners. And one of the questions that we asked them, we were a bank that did a lot of prepaid cards back in the day. We said, how many of the victims that you pick up when it comes to human trafficking, especially in the sex trades, how many of them have prepaid cards on them? And the answer was 100%. And so we started digging and identified that there were indeed human trafficking cases coming through. And we dove in to be able to start to identify what those looked like. What were the commonalities? What were the patterns that we could discern that would help us hone in on what was happening? We created a rule set that was a lot more expansive than the typical rule sets that you see in anti-money laundering behavior. Typically, we look at a dollar amount, a time horizon, and a velocity. Those are the three factors we can use to be able to determine if there's a potentially unusual or suspicious activity occurring. What we did in this case is we took a pool of 12 different conditions that were present in most human trafficking cases, and we said, okay, if we meet a criteria of half of those triggering, right, or those alerts being met, then we're going to escalate that as a case. So as we put those new rules into place, I think you referred to it earlier, our typical false positive average across the bank was 94%, which means out of every 100 work items I get out of my detection queues, only 6 of them go to case. Pretty terrible metric. As we started applying these additional details to the human trafficking problem, we identified that we could find those cases at a much higher frequency. In fact, our false positive rate dropped to 18%. So we were able to reduce our false positives by almost 80% just by focusing on exactly what it was that we were looking for. So the first 90 days that we turned on the rule, we found 750 potential cases, and we escalated 612 of those. It was a game changer, I guess, for me sitting in the chair, because it had been such a blunt instrument prior. And to be able to address that kind of precision and bring that to the table, that was kind of my aha moment, that I said, wait a minute, there's a better way to do this.
So when you say that's your aha moment, was that what led you to what you're doing now, Section 2?
It was kind of the indicator. It took me another decade to be able to identify how we could better shape what we're doing in financial crime detection. So we created our own typologies and our own methodology we call hybrid threat finance. And so hybrid threat finance really is the study of how bad guys use money, how they use financial services in their tradecraft. We document that into what we call targeting packages. That was kind of the light bulb moment, right? Back in those days when I was working at the bank, to be able to say there's a much better way to structure this and we can detect better at scale. And that's where Section 2 was born. Typologies concept as well as hybrid threat finance. That took me about a decade to be able to evolve. We just are at the point now where we're rolling out the technologies.
So when you say that took you about a decade, you're the CEO of Section 2 now. So you are kind of the creative, the business, but also the execution lead. Can you describe like what piece comes first for you? Is it the mission or is it the systems that you're using? Can you describe, what piece comes first for you? Because I really want to get a sense of this introspective person looking at data to realizing I can be a leader for a company and I can be a leader in this field for financial crime.
Our mission is first, and our mission at Section 2 is to disrupt financial crime at scale. In order to be able to have an impact, we need force multiplication to do that, right? That's not something that if you get the attention of 1 or 2 banks is going to solve any of the problems. So we need that scale and force multiplication. Understanding that we can make a difference in the world by helping to be able to detect, that really is what drives us at Section 2. On the technology side, when I started the journey, I would have had to have probably 200 to 250 analysts to do the kind of work we're doing today. The game changer for us was really getting the ability to use AI to be able to scale. So we still have humans in the loop as part of our operational processes, but really what drove this forward for us, even in the last year, is really the advancements in AI and being able to use that to do a better job and to do things that human beings can't necessarily do. Then we put the human beings in place to be able to do oversight, right, for the machines, and then we roll those out. So when you think about what drives us, it really is the mission, and that's why everyone at Section 2 is very focused around how we can have an impact, how we can help, and how we can make things better. We've also worked pretty closely with law enforcement to be able to train them, help them understand. There's not a singular philosophy, if you will, Rose, when it comes to identification of financial crime. We've always looked at it as fraud, right, and money laundering. But those two are not unrelated, right? Fraud is a predicate source or a revenue generating activity that then drives the need for money laundering. So this is a very connected cycle. And that's really the way that we look at things under hybrid threat finance. We look at this as a much larger financial crime cycle lifecycle, if you will. At the end of the day, we study the business models of the bad guys because they do operate like multinational corporations.
One of the ideas you've talked about is how to incentivize banks to prioritize financial crimes. Could you talk a little bit about this idea, shifting compliance from cost center to a potential profit center?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting paradigm because when you look at the way the system operates, banks are forced into a world of compliance where they have to be the law enforcement agents.
It almost feels like they're paying for this extra department and this extra labor that they're actually not getting paid to do. I think this has been a real catch-22 in our 21st century model of all of these enormous companies. Why should they pay for the regulation of, the bad actors?
No, it's a great question, and I don't think if you talk to any bank executive in the C-suite, they would ask the same question, right? It's not something that they choose to do. It's something they're forced to do as a condition of their charter. It does become a cost center for the financial institution. I mean, I was at a fairly small financial institution where I was a BSA officer, but I still spent millions of dollars, right, trying to comply. So what happens as a result of that is that we end up with what we call a check the box environment, right? I'm going to do the absolute least amount that I have to do to be able to pass the test and to be able to stay out of trouble. If you think about the way the banks operate, they're fined if they don't comply. So that's using fear, that's using a stick, right, to be able to force compliance with the issue. The conversations that I've had with law enforcement, with the regulatory authority is, look guys, we're going about this wrong. What if you made this a carrot instead of a stick? Gave them incentive to say, look, if you seize these assets, you'll share in that reward or whatever that looks like in order to incent banks to at least break even, because now they're not coming close to that. So it would put things in a much different light if we completely change the system and the way by which they're measured. And I think you'd see a discernible change at the bank level, right, to be able to say, okay, well, now this is a bit of a game changer. This is not about doing the minimum anymore. It's about potentially turning this into more of a profit center.
Could you give me an example of how let's say 2 decades from now, the Debra version of how this is working and playing out? Banks could keep a percentage of, let's say, the recovered money from financial crime. How do you see that those ripple effects could positively impact our society and our economy and a different revenue generator for these banks?
If we file and there is proven to be a true illicit finance source here, obviously you have to put some guardrails in place. Otherwise, they just seize accounts without having the appropriate controls in place. So we have to make sure that those are there. But once you do that and you identify that this is truly an illicit finance scheme, the government seizes those assets, right? Takes control of them. Let's say we gave you 5% of whatever that proceed was of the monies that you were able to recover on behalf of the government. It would change the initiatives, it would change the paradigm, it would change everything about the way that the system operates, because no longer are we trying to avoid disrupting customers and looking for just check the box compliance standards. Now we're actually looking for illicit finance behavior that are so disruptive and so problematic. But I think if you can make sure that you've got the controls and the framework in place and shift, right, the dynamic of that entire system, you have a whole different result.
And can you talk a little bit about your goals with Section 2? Challenges and opportunities that you're looking at, let's say, this year that you haven't yet encountered before?
Being able to focus on how we can really have an impact with Section 2 Inc. has certainly been an interesting journey. The biggest challenge, I will tell you, probably as a female CEO, is working with things like the venture world. It's a very different paradigm, right? Keep things going, right, in order to be able to sustain operations. Tech-centric especially is a fairly male-dominated world. Sometimes as a female CEO, I get questions like, well, why would you want to do this now? And so that's been an eye-opening experience and a bit of a challenge. And being able to be in a position where you're asking people for money, it's not something I'm used to or comfortable with yet. I'm still learning my way through that. So it's presented a whole number of challenges to be able to get here. But I will tell you that the team that I have in place today, Rose, is phenomenal. They have jumped on board, and not because I'm paying them huge money. In fact, many of them right now are working for no money, but it's because they believe in the mission. We want to be able to get this out here. We are right on the cusp of getting some banks on board, some partners on board, and being able to really move this into the mainstream. So it's exciting times for us.
What does 2026 look like in terms of growing when it comes to partnerships and when it comes to growing your team? And, I imagine your team is probably a combination of engineers and, let's say, forensic experts.
A great technology team who has been leveraging how we build typologies and automating that process. And then we have what we call our Special Investigations Unit, our SIU, who are field operators, right, that understand financial crime. They come from the law enforcement world, they come from financial services, but they've all adopted the whole hybrid threat finance. Right now, we're looking for what we call our charter founding group. So we're speaking to a number of banks to be able to be part of that. We want a tight-knit, focused group of banks who can be leaders in the industry, that can see what we're trying to do, that can help us understand what they're seeing in their own data, right, and really help shape the industry and the policy going forward. We're only accepting, I think, at a maximum of 5 financial institutions into that group, and we're most of the way there. So we've got several at the table. We've got several partners as well who have said, we want to be able to do this better. We recognize that it is challenging the way that we're doing, and we are working to create a consortium.
When it comes to financial crime, do you think that there is a opportunity to specialize, like in a certain kind of pattern or a certain illicit industry?
What we do specifically is we focus very heavily on what we call the financial crime lifecycle. And that starts with the predicate source of funds. So if you think about the way that that illicit networks operate, they, just like everybody, have to generate revenue.
So
right?
Thinking about it almost like a food chain.
It is a cycle. So for example, when you see revenue that starts in human trafficking, it takes a very defined path through the laundering process and then comes out into what we call operational sustainment. So as we look at the life cycle, it starts with revenue, and then it moves into placement, right, where we get it into the financial services system, layering and integration, which is your typical laundering patterns, and then it comes out in what we call operational sustainment. Because in current detection, we only look at the layering or the placement, layering, and integration steps, we miss the signals that are present in the revenue generating phase and in the operational sustainment. There are a lot of good signals there. We understand that human trafficking type of revenue takes a certain path, and each organization that is involved in human trafficking as a revenue generating activity has a certain fingerprint, right? So this is the way they've raised money, this is what their business model looks like, and we can tie it back to that particular organization. So for example, if you look at an organization like Gangster Disciples, right? They tend to be involved in human trafficking, but they tend to operate in certain geographic areas, and they do certain types of human trafficking that are very indicative of their own financial DNA or foot or fingerprint. And so it is very illustrative. Not only can we see what's going on and how the money is flowing, but we can see who it's tied back to. And we can make a pretty good educated guess based on the tracking of those threat networks as to who's involved in the activity.
Well, it sounds like you're poised to really tackle this next decade of financial crime, and I'm really excited to see what you do.
Thank you. Yeah, there's a lot going on, and I think that if we can just start to shape the paradigm and reposition how we look at financial crime, I think we definitely can have an impact that's going to create a ripple effect.
Well, you've got the scale now that you have the AI implementation, so now it just comes to the next part.
we consider this is not just a technology that we're putting into place. This is a whole change toolkit, and that's really how we approach it. So we train analysts as to how to look at the problem and how to look at the financial crime life cycle, help them with implementation. We help them understand the risks and the threats with what we call a threat risk assessment. So we try and address this holistically. It's not just one change and we're going to change the paradigm. It really is a way to be able to think about the world.
And where can folks find you and your work?
We can be found online at section2.com. We also have a LinkedIn page that you can reach out to us there via email or any of those channels. We're happy to have a conversation if somebody wants to learn more.
Well, thank you so much for your time, and I really appreciate your work and your mission.
Yeah, thank you very much, Rose.